Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's installment of this year's spring seminar series hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Dimitris, and I'm the director of the center, and will be moderating this talk. Now, a brief note on the speaker series. Each year we invite scholars working in different aspects of Hellenic studies, very broadly defined, to present their research on a wide range of topics in the fields of archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, as well as literary and cultural studies. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Tibetan peoples. Some housekeeping keeps being pushed back in proper beginning. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom and privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit the SFU IT Services website. As for our online audience, if we run into any technical problems, we will update you in the chat, but please do know that this event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date if you miss something because of technical difficulties. Now, I'm very pleased to present today's speakers, Dr. Evanthia, Baboula, and Marcus Milwright of the University of Victoria. It's been indeed a very long while since we met, whether in person or virtually. In presenting them, I'll be doing some disservice to their CVs because it would get a bit long. So I will ask you to do your own research, as they say. But I'll say a few things nonetheless. Dr. Eva Baboula teaches at the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at the University of Victoria, and she has also been carrying the heavy burden of associate deanship for a while. She studied archaeology and art history at the University of Athens and later received both her master's and doctorate of philosophy from the University of Oxford for research on the provenance, use, and exchange of metals in late Bronze Age and Crete and Cyprus. Her interests have more recently turned to historical periods with research on cross-cultural connections, focusing on the relationship of image and world in the medieval Mediterranean, as well as focusing on the Crusader and later Byzantine periods, 12th to 15th centuries, and the architecture and topography of southern Greece in the Ottoman period, 15th to 19th centuries. Dr. Marcus Milwright is the British Academy Global Professor in the Department of History of Art, University of York, for the period from 2023 right now to 27. He's also a professor of Islamic art and archaeology in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at the University of Victoria. His research focuses on the art and archaeology of the Islamic Middle East, labor and craft practices in the urban environment, and cross-cultural contacts in the medieval Mediterranean. He's involved in archaeological and architectural projects in Jordan, Syria, and Greece, and has created the Crafts of Syria and Crafts of Iraq websites. We will be trying to combine two speakers who are not in the same place, so there will be some juggling happening, which has been practiced, but we ask for your forbearance in advance. And without further ado, I hand it off to you guys.
Thank you very, very much, Dimitris, for your very warm welcome. And indeed, it's a very, very happy occasion being here after quite some time. Before we actually begin, I would also like to say that I have come from over the other side of the water, from Victoria, from the land of the Lekwungen peoples and the ancestral lands of the Wasana, Esquimalt, and Songhees people, who have been there for much, much longer than many, many of us have been. And I always think of these, of our connections to the history and the history of political restitution of these lands very, very seriously. It's a burden that we carry with honor. Dimitris mentioned that Hellenic studies is very, very widely defined here, and I would also say that by reading my own CV, it's obviously quite evident that my own, academic adventures have been quite wide-ranging, and I hope that this is going to come out in some of today's presentation and discussion. So the paper that we are presenting here today from 2 different continents, because Marcus is currently at York in England, and needs to start with maybe a few disclaimers and a story. So this is about a few projects that have been going on for quite a few years, and indeed we would appreciate your own feedback and thoughts about where we can take them further. So many years ago, the 2 of us, Marcus and I, started gathering material on the architecture and topography of the Ottoman period towns and cities of the Peloponnese in southern Greece and the southern mainland Greece. At that time, the period's architecture was not that well known, and in many cases, in many senses, it's still not very well known, and it's becoming better known by the hour. One of us having researched the Bronze Age of the Aegean and the East Mediterranean up to that point, and the other one being versed into the enormous world of the history of Islamic art and architecture, we were both aware of the disparity of published materials in those in the architecture of Ottoman Greece, the architectural and archaeological materials that we had. The work was initially facilitated through a 3-year shared research grant, as well as an internal research grant from the University of Victoria. Now, part of what we were doing involved just walking through different cities, towns, villages, and recording. And indeed, what you can see in this slide is just a tiny snapshot of just walking through Nafplio in the northeastern Peloponnese, the second capital of Greece, actually, and trying to acquaint ourselves with what traces of the historic town actually preserved. So a lot of the primary research involved traveling and becoming familiar with the many sites that retained complete or fragmentary standing structures, and not necessarily only Ottoman. This combined walking the streets and alleys of many towns and correlating sites with satellite images. Nowadays, one can do this very easily through Google Maps. So I'm mentioning this in order to show how digital technologies have made it easier, what used to be quite involved. At that time, and we're talking about the very early 2000s, our guide was the archaeological and historical material that had been published, including some archaeological surface surveys, and very importantly, travel literature from the 16th into the 19th centuries. Some lists of architecture in Greece had been published, and notably already from the 1950s by Turkish scholars, such as Semavia Yece between 54 and 56. Makil's work throughout the Balkans was already known, and indeed he was still bringing up very interesting material about the Ottoman period in Greece, and that's to name just a few key figures and works, while publications such as A Historical and Economic Geography of Ottoman Greece, which incorporated multifaceted historical and archaeological work by the Southwest Messenian Archaeological Expedition, including the thorough reading of Ottoman tax records, came out in 2005. Further survey work was done over the years through Corinthia, the Argolid, Boeotia in the mainland, and a lot of valuable work connected travel to the landscapes and features the travel writers had covered during Ottoman times. There are plenty of examples. For example, William Gell from the 1810s, or William Leake from earlier and into the 1820s. Now, much of the more mundane archaeological material came from salvage excavations, and I do remember the excitement of scouring through the dispersed documentation of water pipes, and other waterworks, as appeared in fleeting detail in the Archaeological Reports, a publication that dates back to the 1940s onwards, which are published annually by the British School at Athens with the Society for Promotion of Hellenic Studies. A volume edited by S.C. Bruskari called Ottoman Architecture in Greece and containing entries of almost 200 standing monuments across Greece was published in 2008. Ever increasing numbers of publications, projects, and even now reviews of the field of Ottoman studies in Greece with a focus on architecture and archaeology have taken off, with the most recent addition of a luxury publication by Capone Editions in Athens. And here's the cover of the book, and also the promotional material for the conference that actually gave birth to this book. It's called Ottoman Monuments in Greece, Cultural Heritage in Negotiation, and it appeared in the beginning of this month. I have not actually seen it myself. I've just seen pictures of it, but it already gathers a lot of interest in the daily press. And I may mention this again later. A very exciting aspect of the in situ reconnaissance, which was very much informal, was on the one hand the matching of faint remnants of structures with existing maps from especially the late 17th century onwards, including occasionally some Ottoman representations, or the plethora of cityscapes we have from the late 17th century onwards, such as by Vincenzo Coronelli, and occasionally the identification of structures which had either not been noticed before or had been known only tangentially, or just by matching where we were on the ground with cartographic representations. So the example here is actually an Ottoman representation of the city of Naupactos to the north side, on the north side of the Corinthian Gulf, which is a very, very interesting artifact. What the slide is doing right now is populating the actual the Google map of the city of Naupactos with some, not even all, of the Ottoman features, and showing the correlation with this representation, this Ottoman representation of Naupactos. One of the exciting things that happened, and I'm not entirely sure that you can see it through the shared windows which show both of us and the slide, is that on the right-hand side of the slide, there is part of the physical remnants in situ of a cistern and the edge of what seems to be a mosque if we correlate it with this particular representation. Indeed, there are many interesting finds within Naupactos, some of which have been written about and some of which still remain to be discussed. In the age of drones, such identification might be a less surprising find, but in the early 2000s, there were occasions where, I hope not through ignorance, I have to say that, this was always part of what we were really aware of, being aware of our own fragmentary knowledge of what was already a fragmentary set of publications or that we were trying to find out about through a lot of side research. So there were occasions where we could not locate any pre-existing literature on identified structures. And over the years, this has changed. There have been plenty of other professional priorities for both of us, although we published part of our research findings in an article in the Journal of Modern Hellenism, and I want to acknowledge Dimitris' collaboration on that, actually, quite a few years ago, and a chapter in Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom's edited collection, Rivers of Paradise, Water in Islamic Art and Culture, which was published in 2009. In the meantime, important initiatives took shape in the area of Ottoman studies in Greece. They have never been too far from politics. The understandings of the Ottoman past became at once more nuanced in these years within the academic world mostly, and polarized at the same time in popular perceptions and more entrenched in what became a more entrenched society in the 2010s, with Greece being in financial disarray. The rise of scholarship on the Ottoman period was significantly spurred on by the multitude of initiatives more recently commemorating and understanding the Turkokratia on the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, which was in 2021. At the same time, larger regional developments meant that the war in Syria and Iraq made inaccessible many regions for studying art and archaeology. And when humanitarian problems persist, historical research, widely defined, may either fall in the background or adapt to the circumstances. One of the areas where it has become imperative to reach out to the past by recording is traditional craft, and Marcus will speak more to that point. Marcus's research took him to an Arabic dictionary of crafts compiled between about 1890 and 1908, which documented traditional techniques and materials across a series of crafts, including quite a list that we will see later. And I just wanted to mention that the slide here does show just a snapshot out of United Nations data of the huge damage that happened in Aleppo only a few years ago. And of course, just one of the buildings that were destroyed on the right-hand side of the slide. These considerations gave birth to an effort to record and preserve knowledge about crafts in a way that was easily accessible. The research led to the creation of two websites, the Crafts of Syria and the Crafts of Iraq. They're both hosted by the University of Victoria, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in a while. In addition, a third way of communicating, and one with a clearly defined educational goal, was through the series Talking About Art, which is also hosted by the University of Victoria, and presents single artifacts, often from otherwise overlooked daily contexts. Now, both the research into craft and into the architectural structures we have been looking at converge on that they are part of the Ottoman world, that is, in regions, they belong to regions that had been incorporated into the Ottoman Empire through their long histories. At this point, it is useful to look at what the geographical coverage of the Ottoman Empire is. We have regions that belong to the same political framework with diverse ethnic and religious minorities, people's traditions, and in the end, different histories of gaining self-determination from the empire. The Ottomanization of diverse areas involved commonalities in the spreading of ideas such as mosque designs, urban planning and infrastructure, the prominence of charitable works, often manifested in public water provision, as in the case of fountains and aqueducts. There was mobility of people, notably of administrators and craftspeople, together with the coexistence in some configuration, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile, sometimes just, not just being aware of your neighbor, but not really having anything to do with them, which is relevant to the projects that we are talking about. It is also worth mentioning that while the different regions of the Ottoman Empire have had their own histories of the development of Ottoman studies explicitly, or along ethnic lines of history, categories are very important when we talk about these last few centuries, but they're not fixed and they are permeable. In Greece itself, we have the issue of how do we talk about the Ottoman past, the terms post-medieval, early modern, modern, come post-Byzantine. These are all terms that come into the material that we are discussing. It is increasingly becoming evident that looking at art, architecture, and archaeology, the archaeology of Ottoman Greece, benefits also from considering it in the context of the study of Islamic art and architecture, which expands the scope of investigation also into the coexistence of different ethnic and religious groups, or the knowledge that crossed borders. Since a lot of the material researched and presented in the websites that we have been involved in comes from the Ottoman period of Syria and Iraq, it seemed a good opportunity to form some comparisons with work on the Ottoman architecture in Greece, and a parallel effort to create a website which both records the work done in that area and hopes to be useful to other scholars. We therefore decided to try out that format so as to deposit the material gathered over many years from Greece, and on the way assess the challenges and opportunities such a format would present. In all cases of these websites that we have created, WordPress was used eventually due to its flexibility and due to the fact that you could have different people coming in to input data that could really easily pick up from where the last person left it. The Ottoman website, the Ottoman Greece website that is on this slide is under construction. It's actually password protected so that we can digest these challenges and move forward in a productive way. I did see that the Center for Hellenic Studies just had a colloquium on responsible public scholarship and ancient Mediterranean history, and in the context of the project Peopling the Past. Perhaps some of today's themes will cross over and sound familiar. So the question we are attempting now to address is what the online tools offer and to what extent they can aid in understanding life in Ottoman times. Since recording material for preservation, for study, and education is a primary goal of these endeavors, what is it that the recording material can achieve in the context of disciplinary discourse, first of all? And how can this mode of recording and presenting information contribute to understanding people and their culture in historical narratives, which are often specialized because of the sources that are used for presentation, and thus fragmentary as representations of life? While the scope of this question is wider than looking at individual modern countries, the territories of which were incorporated into the Ottoman Empire at different times, we would like to use these web-based adventures as a case study. And so now, Marcus, it's your turn.
Thank you. So as you've already been hearing, the motivation for working on the site crafts of Syria was the ongoing destruction of cultural heritage that dates from the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2011, and then particularly with the rise of Islamic State, also ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh in the region from about 2014. So I'm putting up here an image of Palmyra, of course, one of the most famous ancient sites in Syria, but also one which was directly affected by these factors. So if we just put the next slide up, thank you. So the thing is that we see the rise of Islamic State, and the maps here kind of show more or less their kind of areas of authority, through 2014 and 15, and it was the takeover of Palmyra that ended up with, one of the events that ended up as a sort of in media across the world. Now, the reason for mentioning this is that what we see is the role again of online sites in being able to track what's going on. So if we look at the next slide, we can see how the use of satellite imagery allowed for a sense of the nature of the destruction. So we're looking at the Temple of Bel within its sort of giant compound, and then the effect of the explosion, which has pretty much obliterated the entire temple. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can actually see a project which was run by the American School of Oriental Research, and this was the Cultural Heritage Initiative. And they were using sort of online tools such as Digital Globe in order to track the major sites in Palmyra. So Palmyra now today is called Tadmor, the Arabic city, but you can see the occupied area and then the archaeological sites, and they run over a very large area. Now, if we look at the next slide, what we can see here is the reported damage from 2014. So I think the point here is that, you know, this sort of online presentation provides a readily accessible means to track the extent and the nature of the damage within sites such as Palmyra. And it's important to find this sort of visual means to collate information that often comes from a wide range of journalistic sources and photographs. And the visual form allows for a sense of the spatial distribution and the timeline in a way which is much more difficult to recover simply from anecdotal information in textual form. And I think also it's worth noting here the distinctions that are made between deliberate or targeted destruction and other types of damage, such as illegal digging and collateral damage through things like artillery shelling. So, of course, the standing monuments and archaeological sites represent just one part of the tragedy of the country. Now, if we just go to the next slide, we can see, again, you know, this is from that same project. And what we have here are examples of, you know, some of the tomb towers that were destroyed. So the ongoing war has obviously led to a huge loss of life, internal displacement, and a refugee crisis. The long-term erosion of the infrastructure of the country has been exacerbated in the north by the recent earthquakes. And you know, this is something which we can look at with considerable despair, but at the same time, what we're seeing in projects like this and others is a desire to record with the ultimate intention of reconstruction, as indeed is happening in Aleppo with the great mosque minaret, which was hit by shell fire some years ago. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that Iraq too has witnessed the destruction of monuments and archaeological sites from the time of the Second Gulf War to the present, but it too has been affected by the attentions of Islamic State. And notable casualties of that are ancient sites such as Hatra, but also Islamic built heritage, including the tomb of Imam Dor in Samarra from 1085, the Nouri Mosque in Mosul, and the image that you're seeing on the screen here, which is the tomb of Sheikh Kabib al-Ban al-Mawsili from 1239. And it's worth noting the fact that that tombs were seen through this sort of very fundamentalist Sunni perspective as actually being sites of idolatry, and so this is why Islamic sites were often destroyed. So there are also many dimensions to the human tragedy in Iraq and then also in Syria, but one part that comes under the purview of art history is the linkage of cultural activities to place. Relevant in the present context is that Syria, as with many other regions of the Middle East, possesses an immensely rich tradition of manual crafts, existing in major cities as well as regional towns and the countryside. Ethnographic and historical evidence points to the fact that crafts are often passed down through families over generations. meaning that single towns or regions within the cities came to specialize in the manufacture of specific goods. So if we just do the next slide. And a telling example of this is the old market in Aleppo, which until its destruction by fire in September 2012 was subdivided by trade in a manner that would have been familiar to a medieval viewer. It was this sense of chains of transmission of the knowledge of the crafts, that these were being severed, that provided the stimulus for the creation both of the crafts of Syria from 2016 and then later the crafts of Iraq from 2018. These are sites that are now sort of open to view, but we continue to kind of update them. And before we actually kind of move into looking at them, I also want to say that these are sort of collaborative. Much of the funding that's gone into this is actually paid for graduate students and some undergraduates to actually work on both the design and the creation of content which goes onto the site. So, sort of say there have been many students who've been involved with this. So I think if we can swap.
I stop sharing. Okay.
Right, and I will share my screen. So what we can see here is this is the Crafts of Syria site. So I'm going to just start by taking us to the home page of the site, there we go. And as you can see, there's a wide variety of ways of accessing the content within the site. So if you look up at the top, you can see that we have major cities, and of course under these we find a good range of different activities. Now Damascus has the most as it stands, but I'm going to show you Aleppo because obviously we've talked about that and seen some images. So if we click on Aleppo, what we're going to see is the different activities for which there is specific historical evidence. I'm going to go into how this is kind of defined in a moment. But if we look at a particular example, so if we take calligraphers, then what you can see is we have short summaries of the historical evidence and then citations to go with them. So we have the same process also for towns across the country. You can see them listed here, as well as other material which doesn't sort of sit within sort of specific locations, but is associated with regions. There are two different ways of accessing the crafts, and I'll talk a bit later on about why it's important to do this, but you can see that you can look at it by specific name, or as we can do here, to think about categories, which is media and sometimes particular types of things. So if we take, for instance, metal here, you can scroll down and then see the range of different crafts related to metal listed there. Now, if we go further across, you can see that there are also external sort of resources which are to help understand some of the content within the site. I'm showing you here the glossary, and this combines both technical terms in English as well as Arabic and other language terms which are relevant to understanding the material on the website. I'm taking just here the example of tea, so it's all sort of alphabetically organized. So we have things like styles of Arabic script, as well as technical terms relating to textiles and production of leather, for instance. And then finally, if we go across, you can see that we also have a gallery with a range of different sort of images as primary sources. here, and a lot of these have actually come from the Library of Congress that has a very extensive collection of photographs of the late 19th and early 20th century from the Middle East. And finally, most of the sites are also identified using Google Earth on a map here, which allows you to kind of orient around the country. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we'll go back to the presentation.
Press the wrong thing. And I think, yeah.
Great. So the central idea in both cases was to provide an accessible source for the primary sources, and this is meant in a very broad sense. So this includes historical texts and archives, photographs, illustrations, archaeological evidence and inscriptions dating between the 7th century and the present. And these are sources that confirm the manufacture of a given medium or type of object in a documented location at a specific time. Thus, the site was not designed to repeat common art historical assertions about schools of painting or stylistic trends, but rather to record examples that demonstrate that a type of object, understood in the most broad sense, was being manufactured at a site. In some cases, such as dated inscriptions, this might be fixed to a single year, while in others, it might provide a chronological range during which an activity took place, as would be common with, for instance, excavations of kilns or glass furnaces. In all cases, the source was summarized in the online entry with a citation provided for the original source. Emphasis was placed on practical information relating to the making of things, as well as the nature of the chronological and geographical parameters. Entries also provide suggestions for related crafts that a user might want to access in order to broaden their understanding of the topic. So next slide, please. Another important issue to highlight at this stage is that there's no attempt to make on either side or to construct a hierarchy of primary sources according to their perceived reliability as records of the past. So I'm showing you here, sort of the types of source material that one can be using. So we have the larger image is an excavated ceramic workshop from the site of Tel Aswad, or the Black Hill at Raqqa, dating to the late 8th, early 9th centuries. And so here we actually have, the complete workshop and a lot of material found around it, in the waste heaps and so on. We see the image of Muhammad Said al-Qasimi, one of the authors of this dictionary of the crafts of Damascus. And then a couple of inscriptions, both signaling the names of makers. The lower one, Ghaibi Ashami, who was actually a Persian craftsman who relocated to Damascus before then moving to Cairo. And then at the top, a famous inscription from a piece of metalwork known as the Baptistry of Saint Louis. And what we see there is it says Amal Mu'alim, made by the master Muhammad ibn Hussein, Khofat Allah, slave of God. So, these are, sort of well-known and important inscriptions. So going back to the issue of sources, if we just put the next slide up. While it would certainly be the case, so there's no attempt to look at the reliability of sources. And I think it's important that this lack of distinction presents a marked difference to the critical way in which primary sources are handled, for example, in an academic publication on Islamic history. Now, it would certainly be possible to provide critical annotations to the primary sources surveyed in both sites. But there are reasons beyond simple practicality for avoiding such an approach. First, it would involve the application of different types of source criticism, as would be appropriate to historical, epigraphic, archaeological, and ethnographic research. That would likely result in a confusing format for the user. Second, the sites concentrate on the task of making information available to users, such that they can extract the data as is most applicable to their needs. And third, I've argued elsewhere that the study of traditional crafts requires an imaginative search for sources, including travelers' accounts and commercial photography. And as the manufacturing sector is usually neglected in most genres of pre-modern Arabic writing. So what we see on the screen here, sort of examples of, those sort of travel writer sources, ranging from people like Gertrude Bell and Ali Bey Abbasi, who are both, sort of intellectual, sort of academic sources, to things like John Kelman's From Damascus to Palmyra, which is a sort of more popular work. But if we put up the next slide. But we see the same issue when we look at photographs here. So though these are precious records of manufacturing activities, we have to be aware of them as constructed images being potentially posed, but also reflecting certain sort of Orientalist concerns, both of the makers of the photographs and then of their audiences. So the reason for looking at these sorts of things is that, we often find that manufacturing sector is neglected in genres of pre-modern Arabic writing. And it's worth noting in this context that the status of artisans was relatively low in pre-modern Arabic culture, with scholarly elites focusing their attention largely on political and religious matters, as well as science and poetry. The question of source criticism remains an important one, however, and one avenue for the future might be to add into the tools introductions to the study of different genres of written and visual source. I will now hand over again.
Okay, thank you. So we thought it would be instructive to have a look at a sample of websites that deal with architectural remains in the Ottoman architectural remains in Greece. And by no means this is a comprehensive survey. And it doesn't include museum sites which may have presentations of entries around types of objects or individual objects that they have in their collections. So it's very interesting that there is a lot of overlapping material, including, what the website that I'm going to show you from the University of Victoria is actually trying to do, and trying to be self-reflective here. So there is a common theme here in quite a few of the sites of trying to map locations, trying to map architecture, trying to map travelers' accounts on that geographical space that modern Greece covers. This happens to varying degrees of success or varying degrees of completion. So I wanted to mention this particular initiative, which is only snapshotted here on the left, Heritages, which is an initiative, most of the École Française d'Athènes, which goes into detailed documentation of particular sites and particular types of architecture that have remained. There are other ones, such as the Mapping Ottoman Epirus website database, which is an initiative of the University of Stanford. At the moment, the website or the project website is not accessible, but I do expect that there's a lot happening behind it. But this is to bring the point across that resources are very important in how you gather material, how you present it. And there are many projects that include a lot of people, a lot of knowledge. And it doesn't necessarily correlate directly that when you have, a big team, you're necessarily going to have the most complete online presentation of materials or commonly available to everybody. So one finds that some of the more nimble presentation of the evidence also works very well at times. I wanted briefly to mention initiatives such as the archaeological κτηματολόγιο. It's essentially the archaeological cadastre of Greece, where different sites are mapped on the spatial, on the actual geography of Greece, with a view to pinpointing to the actual architecture and the borderlines of the property around this architecture as survives for the purposes of recording space by the Greek government. There are older sites, such as this one, which I've always found very, very useful, but at the same time, it has some interesting features. So this is an initiative by the Cultural Ministry of Greece, which goes back many years, at least to the early 2000s. It was, I think it was kept up to date for a very long time. I personally cannot see evidence that it has been kept up in the last few years with in the same rhythm, with the same rigor as in its early phases. And I thought I would point out here on the left-hand side, which is a snapshot of that initiative, that the categorization of the sites actually happens according to the conventional distinctions between ancient, Byzantine, and modern antiquities, modern architectural heritage. In Greece, this speaks back to distinctions, actually administrative distinctions happening which occur within the Ministry of Culture. And so if one looks here specifically for where the Ottoman monuments would fit, you might think there is no space for them. In reality, there are places, there are entries which are divided between Byzantium and the modern times. So this is very interesting because categories, and I mentioned earlier the different terms that we use for referring to the Ottoman period in Greece. We do refer to it as post-Byzantine, post-medieval, early modern as well. All these things actually have a practical reflection on how we look, how we research, how we gather, how we collect the material, and how we present it. Another site which is extremely wonderful, I think, in what it is trying to achieve and what it has achieved up to now, is the travelogues by the Laskaridis Foundation, which I think it's a much larger collaboration that includes the Gennadios Library in Athens. It's essentially it's called Travel Trails as well, and it records travel accounts. It goes into great depth into indexing travelers' accounts from the last few centuries. It includes mostly European travelers that went through Greece. A lot of these people are very well known, but I think it's an amazing feat that they have been indexed to such detail that you can go in and find the actual digital texts that have been digitized and look for information for actual people, for artifacts, for architecture. So all of these initiatives do end up with maps that have lots of dots on them. That's one of the common factors, and I think it would be interesting in the end to see what might happen if some kind of an integrated approach at some point comes together to see what the overlap between the different types of mapping are. So here's again a snapshot from the same website, then it's the same initiative, showing how on the left side, a particular work, a traveler's account, has been digitized. This is, and in relation to one particular city, one particular place in the southwest Peloponnese, Koron, which has a beautiful castle, and still the castle is inhabited. The castle has gone through many, many different historical phases. It's inhabited by people today. It has houses with small little fields around them, tiny fields for growing vegetables. So the beauty of such a site is that depending on resources, you can bring in lots of other materials, and so representations, depictions of the cities, of the places, of the villages, of particular structures can actually be integrated. And that's to an extent what we are also trying to do, but with fewer resources. There are other sites. I wanted to mention the Ottoman Corinthia site, it's very focused on one part of the Peloponnese, and the northeastern part, which has, of course, many more antiquities besides the remnants of the Ottoman period. Sites like this try to document as much as possible, but of course you can never be complete. There's always space to add more material. And lastly, I think this is the last one from the sort of short survey that we're doing. I wanted to mention this one. It's called Castrologos, or castra.eu. I think it's a fantastic site because it reflects the results of very hard work, but by one individual, mostly, who I understand is an engineer, Manolis Papathanasiou. And I wanted to refer to what the site says are its major aims. The aim is to build a database with all medieval and post-Byzantine castles, fortresses, towers, and city walls in Greece, and present it online. That touches upon many different historical phases, of course. When finished, the site will contain complete data for approximately 1,200 fortifications. At the moment, it contains 1,040. So the actual number may have changed since this particular piece of text was written, but it does show that even looking at castles and fortifications, different types of fortifications that were built or have some evidence of construction between the 5th, 6th centuries to the 19th century, there's a huge wealth of material. And there are many of them that have Ottoman phases of construction. So this again is a fantastic piece of what becomes source material in the end for others to use further. So it shows that, these websites and, our different endeavors actually build on each other, but they feed on each other. There's a lot of overlap. Now, I wanted to show you briefly some snapshots from our Ottoman Greece website that we host at the University of Victoria. And to mention that, what we have done here is we are trying to include most of the material that we became aware of that we collected over years. It does not include just Islamic or Muslim-oriented material. It's not just about mosques, but we do try, and fountains, patronized by Muslim patrons and similar structures. But it does include material from sites that were inhabited, that have habitation phases that fall within the Ottoman period or the different Ottoman periods of Greece. But we're trying to find a productive way of sort of distinguishing those so that the Ottoman mostly infrastructural material that is there can actually be distinguished, and somebody could come and study it further from other structures that may have been built, for example, in Byzantine times. There are indeed lots of churches that continued to be used during the Ottoman phases. Now, this website is also built through WordPress, and it has a similar structure to the ones that Marcus showed earlier, the crafts of Syria and crafts of Iraq. So once you are inside the website, you can go through a map with the different regions of the Peloponnese and the southern part of mainland Greece, where we have mostly collected materials ourselves. And if you go further into these regions, you can pinpoint to cities. We have made a basic distinction between cities and towns. It's a heuristic device mostly, because we are following the modern administrative distinction really between a city, and there are a few of those in the Peloponnese, 1 or 2 in every district. And then we have other sites which are smaller, sometimes sites that are, castles fall into that category as well. They may have been very, very well-known historic sites in the past, but they're not necessarily within the confines of a city or a town. These now in our contemporary times, but we do put them with towns for the goals of the website for now. This particular endeavor, again, is a continuous effort to refine things and refine the kind of knowledge that's included there. At the moment, actually, it's mostly a shell for inputting more information in the near future. And it has been created, in bits and pieces over the years. That's one of the challenges. So once you go inside a particular city, let's say in Corinth, then we have structures that have remained. We go into the documentation for each one with bibliography and further materials. And again, a lot of that work is in the making. There is a categorization, according to regions and towns. Just a few lovely pictures that I wanted to show on the upper left with an image of the map that we are slowly populating. And here too, we have a section for putting photos. And at the moment, we are sharing the photos that are openly for usage, for public usage from the Library of Congress. But there is much more that we are including and that will be included in the future, not necessarily in terms of the images themselves, if they're not in the public domain, but with links as well, just to ease access. This site as well has a glossary, and I know that the picture on the left, the snapshot on the left, does not actually show very much, that we cannot really read it clearly now, but I want to give a huge shout out to my 2 wonderful students, and Darsu Yazidoglu, who is my master's student at the moment and is doing amazing work for this site, although it does not fit her own research topic for her master's, and Atri Hatef Nayemi, a scholar who works on Timurid art and architecture. And Darsu and Atri have been working together, have been collaborating even to the level of creating the glossary, where they are combining, we are all combining our knowledge, Greek, Turkish, Farsi, and a bit of Arabic to come up with terms that might not always be extremely well known for Ottoman Greece, but that we hope other scholars can come later and can also augment and say more things about these. So I just wanted to close this section by saying that there are common goals in what we have seen, both in terms of the websites that we survey that other teams have been putting together, and hours. There is the documentation and the inclusion of actual research, the presentation of research, and creating greater access for others to come, even though we are talking about projects in progress, is very, very much behind what we are trying to address. At the same time, nothing is perfect, nothing is completed, and the sustainability of these projects is a very, very important issue. I think that you start, and all teams start with the goal of creating something that's usable, very, very accessible, and that is sustainable for the future. But I think even with some of the websites that we have seen, most teams run into the same issue, that after a few years, you know, you run out of money. Technology runs very fast. The digital technology just is always ahead of you. So you always have to think of ways to stay faithful to your original goal, but also then again to adapt to everything that's becoming so much more accessible nowadays, where you have social media, you have lots and lots of different bits and pieces of information that you have to make sense of. So some of the questions that we have about the, you know, what the online tools can achieve, actually really come out of some of the practicalities that we have seen. They have the advantage they have over publications, over print publications, is that they're sort of luxury databases. You know, you can try and put everything that you have and add images and make it also attractive, visually attractive. At some point, you need to think about how that is going outwards, you know, how it's becoming accessible, and by whom? Is it other scholars? Is it, how am I presenting this to a wider public? So we don't really have answers to these things, but these are some of the questions that we wanted to bring up. And let me see whether, yes, we are going back to Marcus, I think, for bringing up the relevance of the crafts in this work.
Thank you. So, I mean, following on from those kind of practical considerations, I think one of the issues is thinking about how a site's going to be used, which then gets into how you define things, how you allow them to be searched. So the format of the Crafts of Syria was designed to allow for a variety of ways of finding out about the crafts. And there was an emphasis on the principal media used in each case, and this formed, you know, one of the organizational categories. Another difficulty is that primary sources often deal with the crafts at different levels of specificity. Hence, one might talk in general terms about pottery, where others will talk about the manufacture of specific vessel types to perform functions, or perhaps, you know, decorative characteristics. So if we look at, you know, the already mentioned Dictionary of the Crafts of Damascus, which was written at the end of the Ottoman period, this was the product of 3 authors who all came from important families in the Syrian capital. So Muhammad Said al-Qasimi died in 1900, his son Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi, who died in 1910, and then Khalil al-Azam, who died in 1926. Now, the thing is that this actually provides chapters on 400, more than 400 different crafts, and the terms used are hirfa or sana, many of which fall outside the usual definition of the English word craft. But what's happening here is that often single activities are nested into larger ones, such that the authors devote, you know, a single chapter to the making of padlocks, and yet in another chapter about the blacksmith or iron worker, they include padlocks among the various things that that person makes. So you can see this creates kind of challenges as to how you actually define things and then allow them to be searched on websites. So what we can see is that online and conventional activities are all part of an effort to understand the past using sort of these various diverse tools. But I think one of the things we can get into is whether it's possible to make multiple or interconnected narratives around a single object that might help users in their understanding of Ottoman material culture and its socioeconomic and cultural context. So as a way of thinking about that, what I want to do is to just move on to looking at a different site. And this was sort of a product of the pandemic. It was a decision to try and make a series of podcasts. So what I'm going to do is, if we just shift, I can just quickly show the site. So again, it has a very simple basic structure to it. So I'll go back here. This is the site is called Talking About Art, and you can see that each one is a separate entry here. They're not in any sort of specific order. They're here in the order in which they were done. But you can see that there are several kind of related to Syrian topics. This is an example of a painting which is actually made using coffee grounds. It's made in Hama. Again, from Hama, you can see a block printed textile here. So they're not objects of sort of major art historical significance, but rather it's this idea of object-based study and how you can draw out different narratives from it. So if we take this particular example, which is a brass lunchbox, or what might be called a tiffin tin, it's made out of several components, and what you can see from the photographs is it was originally tinned inside, which was required to actually make it something that could actually be used, so you wouldn't get metal contamination from putting food in there. So you have the images, and then you can click on the podcast at the top, and each one is done in a fairly consistent format throughout the site. So I worked here with Mike Houston of the Sim Lab in the Fine Arts faculty, and he created the format, and then I recorded the content, and this again was all done while we're all kind of stuck at home during the pandemic. So if we just go, I'll stop sharing and we can go back.
Yeah.
So sort of like the crafts of Syria and the crafts of Iraq, there's an emphasis around the question of making, the broader context of craft, although there are other issues explored here. They're all done in the format of 5 to 7 minute presentations supported by photos of the object. And so the aim is to explore in sort of accessible language what makes these objects worthy of deeper examination. And the choice of objects is deliberately eclectic, including archaeological, art historical, and popular culture elements. Archaeology, for instance, is represented by, for instance, a late antique street plan in Syria to an aerial photograph taken during the First World War. Among the portable objects are Greek shadow puppets, inscribed Islamic ceramics, wooden amulets, and a late 19th century Mamluk revival piece of metalwork. So reviewing this, I came to realize that the format opens out the possibility of creating multiple narratives. This can present objects, whether contemporary or museum items, in ways that encompass issues of manufacture, social context, style, iconography, and subsequent adaptation. Hence, I'm exploring ways to try and create this broader format based around selected objects in which a user can access texts, audio files, videos, and visual data that would be relevant for study or teaching. Now, clearly, some of these aspects are being done for Islamic objects through museum websites, such as the British Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum, Metropolitan, the Berlin Museum of Islamic Art, as well as sites such as Khamsin, Islamic Art History Online. The Museum with No Frontiers, Discover Islamic Art, also provides some fantastic material. But if we just take the example that I've mentioned from the Talking About Art website, you see it here with a sort of much grander earlier example from the 15th century in the British Museum, but with, as you can see, a very, very similar design and function. So both of these are manufactured in much the same way, although they obviously differ in the quality of the workmanship. The techniques employed involve hammering of sheet metal and the addition of cast elements. The Mamluk example has delicate chasing over the exterior surface. Now, a feature that's missing from this piece, but present in the other, is the use of tinning, which, as I've mentioned, would have made it suitable for use. Objects like this can be explored in relation to their form and decoration, at least in the Mamluk case, the relationship of such objects to food culture and the economics of metalworking in Egypt and Syria. I've put the next slide up. Now we can also consider the range of manufacturing processes involved in making the finished objects. I'm showing here the process of hammering, and then you can see a tinner at work, photograph from the Matson archive. Now the photograph you see up at the top is the making of sal ammoniac, or also a more modern term would be ammonium chloride. And this was a vital component of that tinning process. And we have descriptions of the making of this substance, which involves heating up animal urine. And it's quite clear from the process that this is actually creating a series of rather toxic substances. And it's led me on to thinking about the health implications of craft through the inhalation or contact with hazardous materials, the use, the types of poses that people would have, the lack of ventilation and light, as you can see very well in the example of the hammering of sheet metal. And so the thing is that we can look at, collaborative nature of craft as well as those health implications. So if we can have the last slide, please. So this is followed up in the images that we can see here, because in such things as glass working, as we have on the screen, you've got poor lighting, bad posture. You've also got exposure to heavy metal contamination. And also with the creation, as you can see, of acid etched glass, you've got the use of hydrofluoric acid, which is an extremely dangerous and corrosive substance. I've put on another example of Syrian craft here, which is a decorated tent with leather in it, which brings up the issue of tanning. And here we know from the Dictionary of Crafts of Damascus that this would involve the use of arsenic, which is a dangerous carcinogen. So these, again, I think are a whole series of kind of interconnected stories that we can create around objects, so that we can include their obvious kind of art historical interest, but at the same time start to broaden out into the wider kind of social public health implications of actually making objects like this. And it's very much something which is suited to this sort of website context, because it allows you to click and move out into other environments. So this is essentially sort of the future, at least for this type of project that we've been working on. And I think that this idea of creating multiple narratives is something which is one of the great potentials of the online context.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. So in closing, when we started thinking about this paper, we thought we would try and think about the user experience of websites and the evaluation of diverse source materials, whether these are textual, archaeological, material, or visual, in relation to what they achieve. The compilation, the picture is very complex, I think. The compilation of evidence follows academic criteria in these websites, even though there are diverse goals and audiences in mind. So there are some basic commonalities. Clearly, there are challenges with completion and continual updating of the sites, as well as keeping up with the speed of change in digital technologies. But we believe that online tools have a potential to communicate about pasts in a way that is distinct from conventional print publications. On the other hand, online sources can be seen as part of a larger ecosystem of ways to understand the social and cultural context of artifacts in the life of the Ottoman Empire. In the context of academia, presenting and generating knowledge in these ways also subverts the concept of the individual author. This has some practical implications for those developing websites, as it is not common practice for journals to review websites in the way they would books. It would aid the sustainability of such projects if there could be sets of agreed evaluation practices which take into consideration the labor and the intellectual content and the sheer diversity of digital technologies. So that's it from us. We welcome your feedback on these ideas and the websites themselves. And thank you very, very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this. This is really rich. I want to start by addressing the very last issue that you raised about the almost professional academic implications of all this work, and say that in our department, Department of Global Humanities, the recent reassessment of our criteria for publications and what counts started including this segment of materials because we cannot ignore the work that goes into that. But this is a serious disciplinary question that affects how you imagine an academic career and how you imagine your contribution to the field. And with that, I do have questions and comments, but I would like to open it to our audience for any questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. It's also extensively laying out these digital pressures. I know what I'm doing this weekend.
Googling hours.
So much of this is due to me. I mean, I also a lot of questions and comments. One that came up was with the Syrian crafts website. One comment and then just a basic question about that. The comment about this evaluation of sources, which I take the point, Marcus, that you made to part of it. It's really very difficult to not necessarily, it may not be extraordinarily helpful to have any kind of rigorous evaluation or numerical value, for instance, the reliability of a source. That seems to be critical. I've been part of digital projects which try to do that, and even in a much simpler way, it becomes very, very difficult to actually gives any kind of quantitative assessment of the reliability of the source. But I would say that as somebody who works in the legal world as a historian, I work very rarely in photographic sources. And so you mentioning that some of these photographs may have been staged, and when you say that, the light bulb goes up like, oh, of course. But that wouldn't have been my first thought when I looked at that. So having some kind of decal, some kind of indication, maybe even just something as simple as your thoughts to keep in mind when using intensive material, I think would be extremely helpful for someone like me, who would come to this with a great deal of interest, but not necessarily with a great deal of experience in terms of where my feelers should be up or, how to critically engage. So that's just the comment part of that question. The question part of it is just when you were showing calligraphers, I saw I think it was the earliest source on the screen was 1181. So just a basic question, how early do you go back in terms of actually collecting sources? Or potentially if there were sources about calligraphers in Syria, would that be included in the website, or is there, and this feeds into just the wider issue you were talking about, what was periodization, what we call, we divide this, but isn't so basic technical question.
Max.
Great. Yeah, I think I got everything there. So, yes, I mean, there are sources. I mean, there are the sort of classic Arabic geographic texts of the 9th century. So I've drawn material out of that. I mean, there are sort of papyri that mention craftspeople kind of moving from different places to work on Umayyad projects. I don't, the thing is that because this site was limited to the kind of geographical boundaries of modern Syria, I don't think I have anything that's kind of quite that early. There are obviously kind of things dealing with the Aqsa Mosque and the kind of area around that, which indicate, you know, craftspeople in specific places. But you know, I think it's a case of, you know, constantly kind of looking around for new sources. There is, of course, also kind of archaeological material which I've included as well, where, you know, you have examples of, you know, evidence of, you know, ceramic production, you know, from excavated kilns and so on, and that does take you back into the 8th century as well. But going back to your kind of previous, you know, comment, I think that it's, in a way, it's a bit like the analogy is a bit like an exhibition, in that, you know, you have a kind of curation of an exhibition, but at the same time, that doesn't actually delimit how people tend to circulate around an exhibited space. You know, they tend to kind of come up with their own narratives by kind of looking at whatever it is they're interested in. But I think that I do agree that, you know, there's an issue of, if somebody's coming to it without a kind of background in those particular type of sources, that, you know, evaluating information is challenging. And I think having maybe some sort of introductory essays, which or something like that, which would allow people to kind of get into the sources a bit more, because when you've got, you know, something from a charitable bequest document, and you've got another thing from a traveler's source, and you've got another thing from you know, sort of Arabic chronicle, you know, clearly they're very different sort of sources, and this, I think, is you know, a challenge as to how you evaluate. But I think being kind of Catholic about how, or you know, taking in as broad a kind of range of sources initially is relevant here, because, you know, quite frankly, a lot of kind of pre-modern Arabic sources don't talk about the crafts at all, because, you know, they weren't regarded as important, at least to the people writing the texts. So, you know, one does have to kind of look to other areas to get the evidence.
Maybe I can also add that contextualization is very important. It may be very easy at times to do it. As you said, you know, you can add a few sentences, but it's especially important nowadays because we are talking mostly about academic websites that purport to reach out to a wider public, perhaps, at some point, and you want to be able to put disclaimers essentially about the reliability, because you have no idea how people are going to read that. They may just believe everything they see uncritically, or just reject everything because it's academic. We live in an interesting world.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I learned a lot. I'm gonna definitely spending time going through all the websites. I have two questions. The one is just very practical. I'm just wondering how you will utilize or make use of these online tools and your website in your classroom. That's one question. And second question, so I was wondering how you can incorporate intangible cultural heritage into your project, which didn't necessarily put in material.
Thank you very, very much for the questions. I have to say that personally, I have not really used these for teaching. I've only done that tangentially in when I do seminars for fourth year students, and mostly because I teach usually about Byzantine art. So there has to be a very specific context, you know, for the students, you know, to align these interests with the interests of the students. I think that, so your second question was
like creating this kind of online tool or even incorporating into your already
Yeah.
intangible.
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry. So I think there's a lot that can be done. There is actually a lot that is available out there. I did not really mention it, but the other heritages initiative is quite large, and that's actually connected with that book that I mentioned at the beginning, the monuments, Ottoman monuments in Greece, heritage in negotiation. There are other aspects to that that are about intangible heritage. I think it's easy to have a large vision of just fitting everything in. It would be wonderful essentially to reconstruct the Ottoman world in all its different facets, including issues such as, singing and dancing, a lot of other, performative aspects, putting in portable objects. Some of that can be done, but I think it's also important to be pragmatic, to function within, your own limits. I think maybe Marcus can add more, because I think it was talking about art series that really showed the potential of bringing in other types of culture. It's mostly portable artifacts here, but you can do more with intangible culture. Everything being, in a sense, everything needs to be, at this stage at least for us, sort of well-contained projects on their own. And it's really, I find it really hard to think about, the larger picture at times. So how do you integrate everything? An integrated perspective would be fantastic, but how do you get there, without having this huge team, with lots of resources that may stop working in 2 or 3 years' time. Yes. Marcus, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, in terms of side, I mean, I do tend to use the talking about art ones. I think sometimes I was sort of making them around things that I was often using in teaching. I teach a course on traditional craft practices, and so these have been very useful. But I think also I've increasingly been using sort of podcasts of other people as readings for classes, because I think that often they're quite accessible for students, and often kind of deal with a topic in a nice contained way. In terms of thinking about intangible stuff, I mean, this is something which I did think about with the crafts project, because the Arabic terms for craft essentially mean any sort of activity from which you can make some part of your income, that you can live on. And so the thing is that it takes in, cooking, and it takes in performative things, all sorts of things which are beyond that sort of idea of making tangible objects. And I decided to avoid those for this particular site because, I guess coming at it as an art historian or an archaeologist. But the thing is that with a la Cascas, where oh, sorry, is she?
We missed you for a moment.
Yeah.
You were
Oh, I'm sorry. So the oh, sorry, is it gone again?
Yeah, but
Oh.
a little bit.
It's getting
Oh, well, don't worry, it's fine.
Do we have another question? And I don't see something for our audience. I just wanted to know if you may have already seen it. Oh, yes.
Just one very short one. I really appreciated the reiterated emphasis on having to be careful about how you use terms and categories, because actually, I mean, these are very effective tools actually, even for a broader public. So you can actually end up to the reasserting sort of certain concepts that you wouldn't otherwise want to reassert. The other thing I had in mind was so I mean most of it was like spatial mapping that I've seen, but you also see sort of chronological mapping projects, or what is there?
You mean how things develop over
Right.
time?
Like focusing on a certain city, one village. right?
Yes, yes, that's very, and there are actually, you know, with increasing bibliography, with increasing scholarship as well on particular cities and particular regions in Greece, I think this is becoming more feasible, so that, you know, we can take into consideration the research that we have done, but also then research that others are doing currently. This is very much part of what is promising, especially when you look at the representations, the visual representations, such as that map that I showed of the town of Nafak, also in Evanthia, because you can compare with, and that's part not just of online presentation, but, you know, the research that happens behind it. You can actually compare with written sources from the time and see which monuments, which structures may be mentioned before the 1680s, for example, when the Venetians come back, or what happens in the second Ottoman period in the 18th century. And it's very, very interesting. It's a hit and miss game, I think, but that's, you know, what art historians and archaeologists have always done. And I would be very, very interested in trying to show the different phases at some point. We're not there yet for the online presentation.
Pick up on the diachrony issue. It gets really interesting because one of the things that I think historians, at least historians of Byzantium, have not been doing very well is to think about their subjects as they study them in a specific time in dialogue with whatever is older in their space. And I think that the tools that you're talking about and the tools that you've been making create these universes of monuments of various ages and layers that remind us that the lived environment was not the same with our perception of the medieval mind. The lived environment was very rich, and if it shaped any kind of whatever mind, that was a complex kind of operation. And I think these tools are so useful for this kind of revisiting the textual evidence and mining it, populating it with experiences.
Yes, and maybe a simple example is the transition, you know, from a church into a mosque and back into a church, or from a mosque into a church and back into a mosque. This happens very often, but it's not always well documented. And sometimes you see churches, sort of modern churches, that have the orientation, a slightly different orientation from what all the other churches around them have. And, you know, if you go and research it a little bit, it becomes apparent that it was a previous mosque, or there was one in its place, but it has not necessarily been discussed yet. So I think these swaps are very, very interesting to bring up. And Marcus.
Actually, just jumping in on that, I mean, one of the things I think is to recognize the persuasive quality of a diagram. And the thing is that maps, when you do a kind of distribution map, then at least you're saying, well, this thing has existed at some point, and here it is. Once you start doing the chronological thing, if there are kind of talking about those sort of transitions from a mosque to a church, if you're not sure when these things happen, as soon as you actually put it into a period and give it a color on a diagram, it becomes on a map, it becomes a fact. And I think that one has to be quite careful about, you know, the sort of solidity of that type of evidence, because anybody who's kind of worked in archaeology always knows that everything is kind of provisional, and, you know, sort of it might be something, and, you know, you can never be entirely sure.
Well, have you seen the Devastating Beauty website? Paul Stevenson is running this, and it's related to a project on lead pollution in the Roman world. So that fits very well with your interest on health impacts of crafts and industrial production. The Byzantium and Friends website podcast has a really good interview of Paul Stevenson with Anthony Calvellis, specifically on lead poisoning. Apparently, the Romans were really in very bad shape. This comes to very good dialogue with some of the other angles that you've been pursuing with your work. Yes, Jake?
Okay. Just to follow up on that too, thinking about the health consequences and health implications of craft. I wonder if you tried, I don't think you're throwing the ball to juggling so much already, you haven't done so much. But have you thought about how to integrate some bioarchaeological evidence into some of the work that you're doing? Just because one of the things that comes to mind, there's this paper that was published in 2019 and got some, play in the press by Christina Werner and Anita Lundini about nuns in Germany who had lapis lazuli in their teeth. They were actually illuminators. And so they would lick their brushes to get them to a point in their illuminations. And so there's the only evidence of this illumination activity that's taking place in this 11th century German convent in northern Germany, where people had lapis lazuli that comes from Asia or the teeth of these nuns in these many places. So it's one of these areas in which the craft survives in the bones of these people, but it becomes very difficult to represent that or to integrate that into other types, into a website that's focused around maybe spaces or photographs or items. I wonder if that's come up at all, and if you've had any thoughts about how to navigate those types of that type of evidence for craft.
Did you hear that, Maximo, about archaeology, skeletal remains?
Yes, it sounds fascinating examples. I mean, yes, there are exhumations of some of the bodies in restoration churches where they've found, the plaques on them actually saying what their profession was, and looking at, whether weavers actually have deformations in their arms and wrists as a result of, repetitive movement. Similar things have been found with, women in sort of Bronze Age women using kind of rotary querns to grind wheat and things like this. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of potential there. I mean, the thing is, in an Islamic context, there aren't that many excavations of burial sites. For a variety of reasons, and also because there aren't sort of grave goods and documentation around the burials themselves. We often can't tell what activity somebody actually did, but I think that there are all sorts of other areas where we can get into it. Textual sources on Islamic law, talking about materials, and then what I've been doing recently with Graham Rhodes, who's in the occupational health department at UVic, looking at historic photographs of crafts and then actually starting to break down, the health implications of the environments they're working in and the sort of materials they're working with.
And there's always a little bit of a tension between, what the actual research part is for a website, whether the research is part of the goal as well, or whether it's the accessibility to a wider audience as well. Those factors are very important. How much do you incorporate in that instead of a print publication?
Well, if there's no other questions, I'll have to thank you both for being here and whichever form found you here, and for offering a really rich presentation on materials that I think we will all be visiting and trying to understand better very soon. I'd like to echo your concern on sustainability. The SNF New Media Lab has been working on a bunch of digital initiatives, and our biggest stress is what happens when in 5 years everything is obsolete. And you just start thinking what kind of fundraising has to go in order to maintain these kinds of projects. These are really serious questions, but maybe these are the kinds of questions where a collaboration and even a position paper to be taken to a foundation or a funder might be very useful, because we need to create awareness of how this is not something that can happen piecemeal. As we move forward, I hope that we can continue our conversations. We're not that far away. I mean,
That's 40 kilometers. Something.
And with that, thank you, thank our audience. And before we leave you, just a note on upcoming events. We will be posting, the information is not fully available yet. The exact date and details for a talk we're staging collaboratively with UBC, where Fotinikon really will be talking about, I assume, Byzantine villagers, but there might be updates on that. Her recent book is on late Byzantine villagers, is really fantastic. So even if she doesn't talk about that, just read the book. We will also have on Friday, April 28th at 2:30, we will be hosting Catherine Morgan of UCLA for a talk that will take us a bit further back in time. In any case, we have information on all this at our website, sfu.ca/Hellenic, and we'll see you at our next event. Thanks again for being with us, and thank you, Victoria.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.